the pyramids occurring all over the world is a complicated question, actually. They date from very, very different times, and they're very, very different in appearance and in size and all the rest. But what is peculiar about it is that they go in a band. In other words, they're not just anywhere. There's about I'm not sure, I forget exactly what it is, 10 degrees, a 20-degree band that stretches all the way around the globe like another equator. It's not the equator itself, but it's as if it were an equator. It circumscribes the entire globe, and most of the known pyramids are within that strange band. So that sounds as though even over the course of different times, radically different times, thousands of years separating the civilizations from each other, there's some sort of, if not an agreement, a shared knowledge that there should be pyramids here and not elsewhere. It's perfectly possible to build them elsewhere, but they do share this common geographical feature, which is certainly peculiar. Myself and my colleagues are absolutely convinced. The evidence is now actually compelling that there was an advanced civilization all over the world, global civilization, shared cosmologies between Egypt and the Mali in West Africa, and the Chinese and the Indonesians. There was a so-called primitive traditional kind of tribes, aborigines, share a cosmology, and it's that we believe that we're pretty well convinced that stems from a great global, maybe interconnected civilization that went down under catastrophic conditions. We think even possibly, generally speaking, the Old Testament is not the best source for verifiable historical material, but when I forget if it's in Genesis, I think it's Genesis, or one of the early books of the Old Testament, they have the story of the Tower of Babel, and they talk about at one point or another all people spoke the same language. Well, it's quite almost certain that the Eskimos didn't speak the same language as the Egyptians, but cosmology might have been their language, as it were, not as a spoken language, but as a philosophical or scientific system. I take it as a given, because the evidence is absolutely commanding, that the Sphinx has been weathered by water, specifically rainwater, precipitation falling over long periods of time, and it's that coursing down the Giza Plateau, over the enclosure wall of the Sphinx, over the Sphinx itself, and it's that is responsible for the weathering and the differential weathering. For instance, the enclosure wall is far more deeply weathered than the Sphinx, and it's not just that the Sphinx has been repaired over and over and over, it's that the weathering to the Sphinx is nowhere near as severe. Well, if you can imagine water pouring down over the plateau, a lot more water is going to be runoff down the plateau than rain that falls directly on the Sphinx. So you would expect that scenario, and that scenario only, accounts for the water weathering to the Sphinx. So what this means, as a general hypothesis, theory, is that the Sphinx has to have been carved when there was rain there. And the Sahara is a relatively new desert. It's formed around 10,000 BC. Before that, there were long rainy periods when it was fertile savanna, more or less, sort of like modern-day Kenya, you might say. And so the Sphinx is, at a minimum, more than 12,000 years old, before 10,000 BC. The 36,000 years comes from the two Egyptian documents themselves. One is a stone stela, tablet, that records, called the Palermo stone, because it's in Palermo in Italy, Palermo, Sicily, I guess. And it talks about earlier reigns of ancient Egyptian rulers. A whole bunch of them, a lot of them, and they give their names and the number of years that they reigned. And the first set of rulers are called the Necheru, which means the gods themselves, which I take to mean human beings, but fully initiated human beings, who in fact have reached themselves the goal of spiritual immortality. And so you can add up those regnal years. Same applies to the second set of semi-divine rulers called the Shemsuhor, which means the followers or the companions of Horus. And again, it gives the names and the regnal years. When you compute all of those together, you get a date, and then there's the same information but rather fragmentary in a papyrus called the Turin Papyrus. And if you add them all up, you're getting a date. They're in rough agreement with each other, not exact, something like 34,000 or 36,000 years. And the weathering to the Sphinx in and of itself is so drastic. I mean, we cannot put a date on it, but one of our hopes is to get a panel of geologists over there with the right disciplines, the right specialities, and spend as much time as is needed to try to get some kind of even a rough estimate of what it might have taken to reduce the Sphinx or produce the weathering to the Sphinx that we see today. So we're not 100% certain, but it's the Egyptians themselves who are putting this date to their civilization, adding to the argument is that the Sphinx, with its lion's body and its human head, but the human head has been recarved. It's much too small for the Sphinx. It may have been completely a lion in its earlier form, maybe not. Even so, it looks out. It's oriented due east, and so it's looking at the sky, as it were, and so it screams out as an astronomical and astrological marker. So when was the last time the Sphinx, at the spring equinox, these equinoxes and solstices are always important in the ancient alignments of their temples and their monuments, the last time that it looked at its own image in the sky, the constellation of Leo, was about 10,500 BC. So it's possible that it was built, that it was carved then. I don't think that, because at that time, this is in between tremendous catastrophes, those that destroyed that ancient civilization that we mentioned before, the global civilization. So the precessional age before that gives you around 36,000 BC, and that's what the Egyptians are talking about themselves as the origins of the Egyptian civilization. And of course, the quackademic Egyptologists dismiss that out of hand, as though they, in their arrogance, know more about ancient Egypt than the ancient Egyptians themselves. This is typical of academic smugness and arrogance. Also, adding to the mix, the Vedas of India, the most ancient Egyptian texts, also put the origins of Vedic civilization at around 40,000 years. So there's this broad general agreement. Nothing so far that you can so far date with certainty, but it's a good argument. There is only one source for the so-called Hall of Records under the paws of the Sphinx, and that's the great American seer, mystic, Edgar Cayce, called the Sleeping Prophet, who came out with all of these readings in a state of trance. So that's the only source for the Hall of Records. He said that under the paw of the Sphinx would be found the Hall of Records. Now, our seismograph does not know how to go into a trance and channel, and it very definitely found a chamber, a void, a space beneath the paws of the Sphinx, quite deep down to under 5 meters or so of bedrock, and it's there. The problem is that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Hall of Records. It means that Cayce, maybe by accident or maybe not so by accident, came up with what the seismograph has verified. Now, the problem is the Egyptologists don't want to know about this at all, but they're also in something of a difficult position because it's next to impossible to excavate it without a lot of expense, because the water table beneath the Sphinx has risen so that it's rather close to the surface. So if they tried to dig down, they'd be hitting water which is coming in from the water table. It's not going to go away. So to actually excavate, they'd have to build in a coffer dam, which is expensive, that you could pump the water out faster than it was coming in, and in that way explore this chamber, if indeed it is there. That said, the Sphinx, this is an archaeological hotspot. You can't do it in secret, find nothing, and then say, you know, we found nothing. So this would be a huge embarrassment to them. And it's also no good to stick a little fiber optic camera down there, because it probably wouldn't find anything. It'd just be dark water, nothing to illuminate. So it will remain a mystery, and it's also kind of dangerous because you don't want to take heavy equipment in there. The Sphinx is really, though it's gigantic, it's in terrible condition, weathered. It's like, you know, like a rock sponge. So you wouldn't want to do that. I suspect that if ever the water weathering theory is jammed down their throats and they're obliged to accept it, at that point maybe someone will say, well, maybe we should take a serious look at this chamber or void or whatever it is underneath the Sphinx, because it is quite definitely there. As I said, the seismograph does not channel. So we will see, but it's not a matter, let's say it's not a priority of mine. Well, eventually the weight of the evidence finally has to prevail. In the old days, before the internet and before modern, we had the ability with a click of a button to put an alternative theory before millions, even maybe hundreds of millions of people. The academic, the orthodoxy had, like the Catholic Church in the early centuries, they had a lock on the information, and it was next to impossible, not quite impossible, but very difficult to get the word out to a massive public. But now, our video, The Mystery of the Sphinx, with Charlton Heston as the host, probably reached a few 100 million people around the world when all the foreign things showed. So we have a big audience, and sooner or later, as the great physicist Max Planck remarked, that new theories never prevail because of the compelling nature or the weight of the evidence. What happens is that the old guard dies out, and new people who are not as resistant to new ideas take over. It's something like that, except we're not powerless. We have the internet as a battering ram to breach the portcullis of orthodox, of the ivory towers of orthodoxy. Well, Fulcanelli first. I'm surprised that you know about Fulcanelli, and I always wondered. I know that people have always thought that Schwaller de Lubitsch had something to do with Fulcanelli. Fulcanelli is a pseudonym. I mean, Fulcanelli means in Italian little furnace. It's the Italian word for the furnace in which the alchemists brewed did their work. And I always was mystified myself, because the Fulcanelli's books, there are two. The second one I haven't read. The first one, Mystère des Cathédrales, Mystery of the Cathedrals, was an absolutely brilliant book, proving that this arcane, esoteric, astrological, and hermetic symbolism is built into the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and certain of the other Gothic cathedrals. So this is a big discovery, actually. But I didn't know any more than anyone else who Fulcanelli actually might have been. And it turns out there's a recent book written by a French woman called Fulcanelli in French, but translated into English, Fulcanelli and the Alchemical Revival. And in it, Geneviève Dubois, and she, I think, is an alchemist herself. Anyway, she's part of an inner circle that are, followers and admirers, fans of Schwaller de Lubitsch. And so she's done the research to figure out what, if any, the connection was. And it turns out, very interesting, that mostly the Fulcanelli's work comes directly out of notebooks put together by Schwaller and loaned by him to one of his own students and disciples, who turned around and, without asking Schwaller for permission, edited them a bit and published them under the pseudonym of Fulcanelli. And until recently, I mean, that book is published, I think 1926, so a long time ago. And nobody could figure out what the connection was. But it turns out that it is derived from notes taken by Schwaller, and also, according to Dubois, Schwaller didn't mind that this fellow, his student, published it himself. I guess maybe Schwaller himself was not planning on publishing it, but he didn't mind it being out there. So, absolutely fascinating book, and that I think, to a certain extent, closes the book on that particular mystery. There's a lot of them, and probably, Schwaller himself, there are a lot of books there, but actually, probably the best thing for people who are seriously interested is to go to my website and surf around. I think under the Magical Egypt trips, and there might be in several other places, there's a detailed reading list. The reading list in Serpent in the Sky itself has had many additions to it since that book was written back in '79. So anybody interested and who has English should go to those sources, because if they don't have English, they're not going to be able to read the books anyway. So there's a lot. There's a ton of stuff of various aspects of Symbolist Egypt, Schwaller himself, any number of books by Schwaller, the masterwork, of course, the 3-volume Temple of Man, Temple de l'Homme. And so there's a big literature out there. Anyone who's interested, seriously interested, can just quit his or her job and start studying Schwaller and Symbolist Egypt and live happily ever after. Yes and no. The alignment of the pyramids is a matter of considerable debate and contention. Nobody, well, actually, there's one friend of mine who has done, I think, a very thorough job, and Edward Nightingale, done a very thorough job of decoding the mathematics of the Giza, of the plan, the pyramid plan itself. I don't know when he plans to come out with that. It might be somewhere. I haven't been in touch with him for a while. Might be on his website or something of that sort. I don't think it's based. I don't think the plan is based on Fibonacci numbers or golden section, but the pyramid itself, the measures and proportions of the golden section, embody both Fibonacci numbers, phi, the golden section, pi, the relationship between diameter and circumference of circle. So those numbers are there, but not in that context.
We're talking about the Great Pyramid.
The Great Pyramid, but the other pyramids too.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, just to continue for a second, the 95% or 99% of the attention paid to the pyramid complex is directed at the Great Pyramid, but the second pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafra so-called, and the Pyramid of Menkaura are only marginally less spectacular, and my conviction is that if anyone ever really does figure out what the pyramids were built for, they will all be part of those pyramids, plus the other 2 pyramids in Dashur, about 50 kilometers away. It will be one grand pyramid plan, and they are functional structures. They do something, but what it is that they do, they're not tombs for kings. Of all of the loony theories and unsupported theories out there from the, from the New Agers, the the insistence that kings were buried in these pyramids is probably as dumb as any theory there is, and as unsupported as any theory there is. I don't think Colin is right. I think Laval is quite right. I think he is, and I think it may well be more complex than Laval's original thesis, and I think he may have carried it further. But that makes perfect sense. The pyramids are associated with Orion is associated with Osiris, and Osiris is associated with Egypt and the transformational energies of Egypt. So it's a theory that fits in with the way the Egyptians went about things. Zahi is really a field archaeologist. He is an Egyptologist, but all he's doing, he's not putting forward anything that's particularly original to them. He's basically repeating the Orthodox party line. It just makes more noise by it. So it's not as though he's any different from most of his colleagues. He's just more in your face and on television more. That said, do I think he's hiding anything? No, I don't. Actually, I know Zahi pretty well, even though we disagree on the scholarly level, violently actually. We get on quite well on the personal level, and I'm pretty sure that if Zahi were convinced that we were right, he wouldn't hide it, because it would reflect glory upon himself. He's got a big ego. So I'm quite certain he's not hiding anything.
Okay.
No.
What would be the
Moses? There's no historical. There's zero evidence of the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt, and zero evidence that there is a historical Moses. There's also zero evidence actually that there was a Jesus, and there's zero evidence that there was a Buddha. So there might have been a Moses, but the coincidences between Akhenaten and Moses are, well, to begin with, very different in time, but it's quite clear that whoever wrote, I forget what psalm it is, there's a psalm of Akhenaten, which becomes almost word for word one of the psalms of David about the bounty, the wonders of the earth, and so forth and so on. So it would appear that whoever of the Israelites at the time wrote the Psalms of David, whether David himself, I mean, there's no history historically that there was ever a David either, but whoever wrote those Psalms was familiar with Akhenaten and, plagiarized it for the Psalms themselves. But that's about as far as it goes. No, there are absolutely none, and I think the people who interpret the texts of Egypt and the reliefs of Egypt and find alien spacecraft landing there are grievously mistaken. There's no evidence whatsoever. That said, let me say that I'm 100% convinced that the UFO phenomenon is real, but totally equally unconvinced that they had anything to do with the construction of these marvelous things that we see in Egypt. What is responsible, I'm quite certain, for those amazing monuments and sculptures and all the rest of it, is that it's the work of people ostensibly like ourselves, but working at a much higher level of consciousness than we can achieve, except for a few who do, years and years, decades of discipline in one of the esoteric traditions.
So basically said, it's the work of the global civilization,
advanced human beings, rather than
that we started from.
That's right. That descended, that devolved into ourselves, not the other way around.
Okay.
Viewers should know that I lead several, usually 4, intensive study tours to Egypt, and we spend 2 weeks looking at Egypt through symbolist eyes, the interpretation put forward by R.H. Valladolid, and it pretty much has to be English-speaking viewers who would be interested in such a tour, but it is truly a transformational experience. Florence Nightingale, the famous Florence Nightingale, was in Egypt in 1850 and writing letters home. She was an extremely brilliant and perceptive woman, especially for that time, a free thinker, and who wasn't just sitting at home minding the kids, which she never had. But anyway, Florence Nightingale wrote home, and one of her letters to her parents, she says, "One wonders that people can come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before." And this is really true. It's only in Egypt that we modern people can get a sense of the magnificence of ancient vanished civilizations. The others, ancient civilizations, may have been just as magnificent with a shared spiritual doctrine, but not enough is left of ancient India or ancient China or ancient Mesoamerica to be able to, you might say, bask in the glory of the past, as you can't help but do in Egypt.